Number two, that they're thick such that you can't see through them. Right? You can't see through them due to their thickness. But if you can see through them despite their being thick, then that's not a problem. See through Khuffs. I mean, it's not exactly the greatest design choice in the world, but that would not prevent it. Because the criteria is to define that they're thick. The fact that you can walk extensively in them means that they're sturdy. So practically, the conditions that return to the khuf are two. One, that they're sturdy, which is that you can walk 3 miles or more in them, 3 Arab miles, about 5.5 kilometers, to be safe. Number two, that they're thick. Thickness has two criteria. One, if you wipe on them, the water doesn't seep through right away to the skin. Number two, that you can't see through them because of their thickness. That they're not so thin that you can see the skin. Okay. And we'll come to the implications of that on socks when we get to it over there. That's number 6. Number 7, that Nasarullah al-Afiyah, that enough of the foot remain that you can wipe over it. So at least 3 fingers worth of the khuf remain so that you can do the minimum wiping. That the state of tahara not be tayammum, because there's no relationship between tayammum and wiping over foot gear. And number 9, that it cannot be from janaba. So these are 2 supplementary conditions, right? So these are 9 conditions that I just mentioned very quickly. We'll touch upon the conditions of the sock as we get through, but this gives a summary. Just a quick recap. Number 1, wearing them after washing. لبسهما بعد غسل الرجلين. Wearing them after washing the feet. Number 2, that they cover up to and including the ankles. Number 3, that you can walk extensively in them. إمكان متابعة المشي المعتاد فرسخا فأكثر. 3 miles or more. That you can walk extensively in them, which the later scholars generally defined as 3 miles or more. Number 4, that خلوهما عن خرق مانع. That neither one on its own has a large hole, which is the extent of 3 toes of the foot. Number 5, that they stay on the foot without having to be tied. Number 6, that they're thick, mean that they prevent water from reaching the skin at the time of wiping. And with respect to the jawrab, that you can't see through it due to their thinness. Right? Number 7, that at least the extent of 3 fingers of the hand remain of the foot so that you're able to do the minimum wiping. Number 8, that the tahara not be tayammum. And number 9, that the person not be in a state of janaba. Because if you need ghusl, it's generally not concealed that you could take ghusl, and because it's also not established as a dispensation. And we'll see that. So these are the 9 conditions. You can find them similarly expressed in the Nur al-Idah, but it's there in the Hadiyah. We'll share the PDF of the Hadiyah al-Ala'iyah today, inshallah, in the course forum. And inshallah, we'll get you the translation of the section from the Hadiyah al-Ala'iyah on. We'll just send the whole thing on Tahara. Do you have it? I'll share it. Long ago, I thought about translating the Hadiyah, but I gave up on the project because it's best just to listen to one's teachers. That Shaykh Adib had said not to do that. So anyway, that's a separate story. We won't. Okay, so that's the background on the chapter. It's important. The definition of wiping is important to catch because you don't have to use your hands. What if someone doesn't have hands? They can't wipe over the khuf, right? What if someone got their, just like that, if someone, you're making wudu, you wash your arm, someone towel swatted you with a wet towel. If more than a quarter of your head got wet, khalas. It would be valid for wudu, although it would be better to do it yourself. Anyways, and the definition of wiping and the conditions. Okay, and we'll look at the implications as we go through this. Okay, so Imam al-Nasafi tells us, rahimahullah ta'ala, صح ولو امرأة لا جنبا. Right? So he's very concise. If you put باب المسح على الخفين, صح is a فعل. Where's the فاعل? Right? The فاعل here is a ضمير مستتر جوازا تقديره هو. Right? صح, and the huwa goes back to al-masih ala al-khuffayn. Right? But you can translate it, wiping over khufs is valid. Right? Just to make it clear. Right? But generally, where does the dhamir go back to? Right? It goes back to the nearest thing, or what's being talked about. Right? Right? To the nearest thing, or what's being talked about, or what's understood contextually. Right? So صح أي المسح على الخفين. Wiping over khufs is valid. ولو امرأة. يعني أي ولو امرأة, this is very commonly done in the books of fiqh. After لو, كان and اسم كان are omitted because they're understood. أي ولو كان الماسح امرأة. Even if, so ولو, after لو, there is كان and اسم كان is omitted. It's known, understood from the context. Because ولو امرأة أي ولو كان الماسح امرأة. Even if the one wiping is a woman. The reason this is mentioned is that some of the early Muslims said no. And other texts mention that امرأة أو صبيا أو مقيما. Right? Even if the one wiping is a woman, because some said, well, the Prophet did it, is it established for women? Some people said, no, it's not, because it's unique to men, because men have to go out and about, women are at home. Said, no, but it's established from the female companions as well. And it falls under it's a general dispensation, and النساء شقائق الرجال, women are the co-sharers of men. But this because there is an old ikhtilaf, and also because some people say, well, if you're a woman, you're at home, why do you need to wipe? Maybe. So this is why. So for men and women, لا جنوبا, but not in a state of major ritual impurity, janaba. Right? There's a condition. إن لبسهما على وضوء تام وقت الحدث. The condition is that they be worn in a complete state of wudu before the first ritual impurity occurs. Like if you want to wipe over khufs, do you have to put them on right after wudu? No. You made wudu, your feet are kind of wet, but you don't want to you have a towel with you, but you walk around, you walk on the carpet. That's how the masjid carpets get all stinky, right? You kind of let the carpet dry your feet, and then you do a few prayers, so every part of your foot gets dry. Once your foot is nicely dry, you put on your khufs. If nothing happened between making wudu and putting on the khufs that would invalidate wudu, you can put them on, right? It's better to put them on after washing both feet, because in the Shafi'i school, that's a condition. In our madhab, if you washed your right foot, put on the khuf, then wash your left foot, put on your khuf, it's valid in our madhab. But in the Shafi'i school, you have to have completed your tahara before putting on the khufs. So just caution to avoid the difference of opinion. In our madhab, it's valid, but okay. And so it's not valid for someone in janaba, though it's conceivable that you could, in the bathtub, keep your feet suspended in the air right? And use a shower hose to wash yourself without getting water into the khuffs, but it's not established, right? If one wore them on a complete wudu, right? That the khuffs were on before the first hadath happens. One of the important things to keep in mind here, it's wiping over khuffs is sahih, right? Some texts, what do they mention? Jaza bis sunnah, right? It's permitted with the sunnah, right? Right? Or sahha bis sunnah. It's permitted with this by the sunnah, right? It's and we talked about that. It's established by a well-established sunnah, such that it's at the level of being mutawatir ma'nan, right? It's mass transmitted. Generally, enough. So there's no dislike in wiping over the khuffs, even if you do it every day for the rest of your life, validly. However, in general, it is better to wash. Better in that there's greater reward, generally, even for the traveler. Unless they said you have any doubt about its permissibility or appropriateness, then they say it's recommended to do it until that doubt goes. They also said if you're in the presence of an innovator, like some sects don't see the permissibility of wiping over khuffs. So if you know that this person is from a sect that doesn't see the permissibility of wiping over khuffs, but someone learned it because someone ignorant from the sect doesn't know their own sect's positions, then you do it if there's a purpose fulfilled in that. Okay. And we said when one takes the dispensation, it's best to intend iqtida, to follow the Prophet ﷺ, right? It can only be done if wudu is required, not ghusl, right? And we'll see when does the time of wiping begin, right? Because if you made wudu, you put on your socks, what happens now? You put on your khuffs. But then, in the basement of the masjid, and it's not designated as masjid, some people decide to do a sock fight. They're just being kiddish. They take off their socks and they're doing a sock fight. They say, okay, you do a sock fight, I'll do a khuff fight. You take off your khuffs. What happens to your wiping over khuffs? Is it affected? You took off your khuffs. You made wudu. An hour later, you put on your khuffs. Then, an hour later, you took off your khuffs because there's a khuff or a sock fight going on. You join the sock fight with 2 leather khuffs. What happens to your wearing of the khuffs? Anyone?
It's still valid unless you lose your wudu.
It's still valid because you haven't lost your wudu yet. Because the khuff only starts fulfilling its function once a loss of tahara takes place after having put them on validly. Because what is the role of the khuff? They say al-khuffu mani'un sarayat al-hadath ila al-qadam. The khuff prevents the hadath, the ritual impurity, from reaching the foot. The khuff acts like a fortress, right? So let's say, suddenly we find ourselves in the era of the Mongols, and they're attacking. So we build a fortress with 4 gates. Small, we're just a little village of 200 people. We establish a fortress around it. When is the fortress fulfilling its function? When the enemy is attacking. But if the enemy is not around, if we open all the 4 gates, let's say we designed it, we did some this sophisticated design, from inside you could collapse all the walls outwardly. It becomes like a patio. It's fine, because there's no enemy around, right? So the khuff, right? If you put it on, you can take it off, you can do a khuff fight with it, right? Let's say you make a dynamic khuff, that you can turn it into a cap, or you can turn it into gloves. And then you put it back on. You still have tahara, it's still not fulfilling its function. But when the hadath happens, the hadath is an intangible state. Now it's fulfilling its function. The hadath is like the Mongols at the gate. If you take the khuff off, it's like you open the gate, hadath reaches the foot. Okay. Which is why the time of wiping begins from the first loss of wudu after putting them on. Then, after that loss of wudu, you can't take them off without having to wash your feet again. Okay, so he tells us, يوما وليلة للمقيم أي ويمسح الخف يوما وليلة للمقيم. The resident can wipe their khuff for 24 hours, a day and a night, 24 hours. وَلِلْمُسَافِرِ ثَلَاثًا. And the traveler, 3 days and nights, meaning 72 hours. Because it's measured in hours. Right? And then he tells us, min waqt al-hadath. The time of يبدأ تبدأ مدة المسح من وقت الحدث. The time of wiping begins with the first ritual impurity that occurs after putting them on validly. Because of this concept, right? And you can see, those of you who have access to Hashit Abu Saud, he explains it very nicely, quoting Az-Zayla'i. Because the role of the khuff is al-khuffu mani'un right? The khuff prevents the hadath from reaching the foot. And he gives a nice discussion on that. Before this first loss of wudu, your state of tahara is that you washed your feet. Like, forget khuffs. You made wudu, you put on socks. Can you take them off? Does it affect your wudu? No. You put on socks, boots, whatever, right? So same thing. So they give At-Ta'i gives an example, right? That if someone resident makes wudu at the time of sunrise, right? And they only lost their wudu after dhuhr. When does the time begin? So they made wudu and put them on at fajr time, but they only lost their wudu at dhuhr time. When does the time begin? Time of wiping begin? From dhuhr time. Right? It's not from when you made wudu, it's not from when you put them on, but it's from the first loss of wudu, from when? And after putting them on. Now, sleep breaks wudu. Right? Sleeps break wudu. When does sleep break wudu? It's considered from when you fell asleep. Sleep breaks wudu from when you fall asleep. Right? 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 And they mention that as a fara. Okay, so that's the duration of wiping, right? Same thing is unpacked in a little more detail in the Maraqi. You can revise it there to be clear. One of the ways to understand things like this, to apply the principle, make scenarios. And what the Mashayikh would mention, you don't have to make it, some people like colorful scenarios, Zubayr, Zubaydah, whatever, but it helps to make it specific. Or you say it about myself. If I made wudu at 6 a.m., I put on my Khuffs at 9 a.m., and then I didn't lose my wudu till 9 p.m. What happens? When does the time begin? From 9 p.m. Because until then, your tahara was the tahara of washing your feet. Right? And you can do other things, taking off the khuff, other things. Okay, now how does one wipe? He says, على ظاهرهما مرة بثلاث أصابع يبدأ من الأصابع إلى الساق. So there are three statements here. على ظاهرهما أي على ظاهر الخفين أي ويمسح على ظاهرهما, right? And one wipes ويمسح على ظاهر الخفين, one wipes on the upper part, the top. ظاهر here is the top of the khuffs, right? So this is both, this is a condition. Wiping is only valid on the top of the khuff. It is not valid if you only wiped at the bottom of the khuff. It's not valid if you wiped on the side of the khuff. It has to be on the top. That's number one. On the top, this is a condition for validity. It has to be on the top of the khuff, not on the bottom. It's not valid to wipe on the bottom. Number two, in our madhab, one only wipes on the top, not the top and the bottom. There are some hadith that would appear to indicate that the Prophet ﷺ wiped the top and bottom of the khuff, and those, there's khilaf about it being established. And Al-Tahawi and others explained why Imam Abu Hanifa didn't take it, but because the generality of the hadiths only mention wiping on the top, right? So in our madhab, it is not the sunnah, right? Right? To wipe the bottom of the khuff as well, right? And for those of you who are interested, Ibn Abdin quotes from Halbatul Mujalli, which is the commentary of Ibn Amir Hajj on Munyat al-Musalli, that the madhab in the Hanafi school is that anything besides the top of the foot is not a place for wiping, neither the obligatory wiping nor a sunnah wiping. I missed one thing. One wipes over the top of the khuffs once. Okay? One wipes over the top of the khuffs once. Right? One wipes over the top of the khuffs once, marratan. Right? And this is also a significant point. One wipes over the top of the khuffs, i.e. not the bottom and not the sides. It's neither valid nor recommended to do so once. Why? Because repeated wiping with a wet hand turns wiping to resemble washing. So it becomes khilaful mashru', so it becomes contrary to what is legislated. That is the meaning. In transmission, it's what we see from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is he wiped once. So that's what we do. Right? So that's what we do. Once. Right? And that's the basis in our madhab that ما سن فيه الغسل فالتكرار فيه أو ما طلب فيه الغسل فالتكرار فيه سنة. Anything that we're called to wash, generally, not absolutely, the sunnah is to do so 3 times. You see that in wudu, you see that in ghusl, you see that in the removal of filth, right? You see that in istinja, you see that across chapter, you see in the washing of hands, right? But وما سن فيه المسح وما طلب فيه المسح فلا يسن فيه التكرار. Anything that we're called upon to wipe, repeated wiping in it is not sunnah, but rather it's makruh. What is okay is to repeat wiping with the same wetness. This applies in wudu as well. And you can see the details that in our madhab, you wipe the head once. Can you do it another 2 times? Can you do it? Can you wipe the head 3 times? Anyone? It's a trick question, folks. Yeah, the wiping, the repeated wiping that is disliked, contrary to the sunnah, in our madhab, and there's khilaf, you have to be soft-headed in khilaf, because the Shafi'is have their arguments. The wiping that is uncalled for is tikrarul masih bima'in jadid, is to repeat wiping with fresh water. But once in a while, but the Hanafis neglect, the fuqaha mention, it is praiseworthy to wipe once in a while 3 times with the same wetness. It's mansus in our madhab as being recommended once in a while. Hasan, it's good, but without taking fresh water. So you wipe once and another time, and of course, and the wiping over in the head, it's also established that the Prophet ﷺ wiped from the front of his head to the back, and he brought the hand back to the front. That's done once in a while, so it's hasan. It's not, they wouldn't call that recommended because it's established rarely, but it is established. Okay. With 3 fingers, and with 3 fingers, meaning of the hand. بثلاث أصابع, with 3 hands, you wipe with your hands. So with 3 fingers, right? The 3 fingers, or the extent of 3 fingers. If you use your palms, the extent of 3 fingers, or if you use something else, you swatted yourself with a towel, for example, the extent of 3 fingers. And you shouldn't do it just with the tips of the fingers. Some people make a mistake, they do it like this. This is problematic. There are weak opinions in the Hanafi madhab that could validate it, but it's supposed to be, there's a surface area of the fingers, length and width. So you're supposed to put the fingers themselves, 3 fingers or more, right? And then one begins from the toes to the shin. This is bayanun lil mustahab. This is what's recommended. Is one begins from the toes to the shin. This is recommended. Right? If one does it in any other order, just puts one's hand and that's it, it's valid. The sunnah is one begins with the top tips of the fingers, and وَيَمْسَحُ خُطُوطًا, like one opens one's fingers and wipes, because one doesn't with the fingers alone, because one doesn't want to get the khuf too wet either, right? So one wipes with the hand, but the fingers alone are sufficient. One doesn't put the raha as well, because the idea isn't to get the whole khuf dripping wet or anything like that, right? And then one goes to one's shin. So one goes past the ankle as part of mubalagha. And doing it in the opposite direction without excuse is improper because it's against the sunnah. Okay. Then holes in khuffs, the principle underlying it is the idea of hardship, right? And we see there's textual basis for this, but in al-haraj, right? That wiping over khuffs is based on taysir, on facilitation, right? But as established, right? And it's لدفع الحرج, and to avoid hardship. Now, a khuff, it's easy for it to have small holes, so it would be difficult to avoid the small holes. But it's easy to avoid large holes. So that's why he tells us, وَالْخَرْقُ الْكَبِيرِ يَمْنَعُهُ. Large holes prevent it, meaning prevent the validity of wiping. Because it's easy to avoid, right? If you have a large hole, you could stitch it, you could fix it, etc., right? Or you could replace it. Small holes are difficult, especially because khuffs would be used for traveling, etc. So that's excused. Slight, so avoiding a large hole is not a hardship. Is not a significant hardship. It's a slight hardship. But avoiding a small hole could be a significant hardship. So it's recognized, and of course there's a textual basis for it. The ulama differed on that. Now, Imam al-Nasafi does these things, right? He says a large hole prevents the validity of wiping. Then he says, وَهُوَ قَدْرَ ثَلَاثِ أَصَابِعِ, and it is the extent of 3 toes, right? And these, meaning large holes, are the extent of 3 small toes, right? هو قدر 3 أصابع القدم أصغرها, right? Is the extent of 3 small toes. He put it in this way, pointing to the existence of khilaf, right? Because the basis would be that a large hole is that which someone would consider large, and a small hole is what someone would consider small. But the fuqaha said that said it would be the extent of 3 small toes. This is pointed to by some of the riwayat, but the legal meaning is that more than that would be considered large, right? So it is to give a criteria, and one estimates. ويجمع الخرق في خف. Holes are considered together from 1 foot. So if the holes on 1 foot reach the extent of 3 small toes, you can't wipe over the khuffs. But if you have the extent of 2 toes, a hole the extent of 2 toes on 1 foot and the extent of 2 toes on the other, can you wipe over it? Yes, because holes are considered together on 1 foot, but you don't add them from the other. The smallest hole that is considered is a hole in which a large needle, a misalla, wouldn't go through. So like a weaving needle, a needle that you use for carpets, like a thick needle. So small holes are not considered to be a problem. Like, you have breathing holes in some sneakers and stuff. Those are small holes. Those are not considered at all, even if they're all over the place. Right? There's some kind of, sort of hipster kind of shoes. So you have these Oxfords, but they have some mesh kind of. So you make a mesh khuff, but there's tiny, tiny holes all over the place. It fulfills the criteria, but those tiny holes are less than the extent of a weaver's needle, called the misalla. Which is called, the misalla is al-ibratul azima, a large needle. Right? So, small holes are ignored, large holes are considered. Right? So little holes all over. Like, the shoes that have stitching, like let's say boots that have stitching all around. And of course, if there's a hole but it's covered from underneath, if someone's wearing boots could be considered like khuffs. But people say, well, what about the holes for the laces? But the holes for the laces typically have the flap under them, so they're covered. That's not a hole. Because a hole that is covered is not a hole. Then he just puts this thing in, بِخِلَافِ النَّجَاسَةِ. This is contrary to filth, وَالْإِنْكِشَافِ, and the uncovering of one's nakedness. Because النَّجَاسَةُ الْمُتَفَرِّقَةُ تُجْمَعُ. If you have a little bit of filth on your clothing and a little bit of filth on your body, it's considered together as to whether it's a large, if it's an excused amount or not. And we'll be coming to section on filth. What is the excused amount of filth? And you should be familiar with that. Likewise, the awrah. Someone has a little of their mid area of the awrah, on their mid area showing, and a little bit of one knee and a little bit of another knee showing. This is considered together. And the details of that are coming. Then he is considered across the body with respect to how much is excused or not, how much affects validity, how much doesn't. Then we're going to look at what invalidates wiping over khuffs. So he tells us, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayhi, وَيَنْقُضُهُ يَنْقُضُ الْمَسْحَ عَلَى الْخُفَّيْنِ نَاقِضُ الْوُضُوء. Wiping over khuffs is invalidated by anything that invalidates wudu. That's number one. Number two, وَنَزْعُ خُفٍّ, and removing the khuff, right? Removing the khuff. To turn on my autocorrect. Sorry, I'm using a beta version of the new operating system, and the autocorrect's gotten even more aggressive. Number three, وَمُضِيُّ الْمُدَّةِ, the end of the period of wiping. إِن لَمْ يَخَفْ ذَهَابَ رِجْلِهِ مِنَ الْبَرْدِ, unless one fears losing one's foot due to cold. So you're wearing mountain boots and it's freezing cold, and if you make wudu where you are, there's reasonable fear, right? Khawf, unless one fears, i.e. with any reasonable fear, which is fear that has clear signs, which no two people would differ on, or past experience, your own or someone else's. You saw someone else lose their foot. Say, well, let's see if my foot gets lost. No, that's reasonable fear. Or an expert tells you, and you believe them, that it's reasonable fear, right? Due to cold. But in this situation, right? In this situation, there are two positions in the madhab, that if one fears loss of limb by that, then but they relied upon the stronger position. It was chosen by Al-Kamal ibn al-Humam and others, is that in this situation, that if one fears losing one's foot, so the time passes, so the traveler beyond 3 days, but there's genuine fear of loss of limb or of harm to your foot by washing, then this is as if it becomes like a cast. So you have to wipe over all of it or most of it. Right? Right? So in this case, the stronger opinion is that it becomes like a cast, and so you have to wipe over all of it or most of it. Okay. After the last two, right? وَبَعْدَهُمَا, after the last two, one only needs to wash one's feet. So you didn't lose your wudu, right? You didn't lose your wudu, and you didn't remove the khuff. So what do you have to do? You just have to wash your feet. Right? 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 Sorry. So after the last two, which is after removing the khuff and after the end of the time, if you still have wudu, so after the last two, they're numbered differently. So so that's after number 2 and number 3, right? Which is, if you removed your khuff, all you have to do is to wash your feet. If the time ends, all you have to do is to wash your feet. You don't have to repeat the whole wudu. Because all that's happened is the hadath has reached your foot. So you have to wash your foot. Then he tells us, وَخُرُوجُ أَكْثَرِ الْقَدَمْ نَزْعَ أي حُكْمًا. If most of the foot comes out of the khuff, it's like removing it. Meaning, it's like the gate. If you open the gate a little bit and the Mongol hordes are outside, they can't come in. But if you open the door, if you open most of the door, they can get in. Right? So removing most of the foot, because there's the principle, لِلْأَكْثَرْ حُكْمُ الْكُلِّ. The most of something is considered like all of it. It breaks if most of the foot comes out, it's like removing a khuff. Then the wiping over the khuff is invalidated. But if you're still on wudu, you just have to wash your feet. Right? And then he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, that وَلَوْ مَسْحَ مُقِيمٌ فَسَافَرَ قَبْلَ تَمَامِ يَوْمٍ وَلَيْلَةٍ مَسَحَ ثَلَاثًا. If a resident person wiped and then traveled before the end of their period of wiping, they can wipe now for 72 hours. So they're still able to wipe, but they become a traveler. They're still able to wipe, but their period of wiping is extended to the period of a traveler, because they became a traveler before their allowance to wipe was invalidated. And the opposite is also true. That وَلَوْ أَقَامَ مُسَافِرٌ بَعْدَ يَوْمٍ وَلَيْلَةٍ. If someone was a traveler and they became resident after 24 hours. So someone had been wiping for 2 days. Was it valid for them to wipe? As a traveler was wiping for 2 days. Was it valid for them to wipe? Yeah. But now they became resident. So it is valid for them to wipe, but they became resident. So that their period of wiping is only 24 hours. So it means their wiping period's finished. Right? Because the starting time of wiping is the same. So if a traveler becomes resident after 24 hours, they're no longer allowed to wipe. Right? So they must remove their khuffs. Otherwise, they complete wiping for 24 hours. وَإِلَّا يُتِمُّ يَوْمًا وَلَيْلًا. A traveler had been wiping for 8 hours. And then they reach their destination. So they're still able to wipe, and they complete it for 24 hours from the same start point. Again, the way you make sure you understand these is you use, make yourself an example, right? Make it specific, give it timings, etc. Right? There's two underlying principles here. One is that what counts, ما يتعلق بالأوقات فالعبرة بآخرها. Anything that relates to time, what counts is the end of time. And it comes up in prayer as well, right, between the traveler and the resident, etc. The second principle is that الساقط لا يعود. Something that is lifted does not return. Right? So if your wiping was invalidated, you're a resident and your 24-hour period finished, and then 30 hours after wiping, you traveled, what your wiping had been invalidated. Will it now suddenly convert to being valid? No. So this is also another principle that the fuqaha deduce, but you can't just apply it independently. That's ijtihad. But it's good to know these principles because it helps connect different issues. Right? So what can you wipe over and what can't you wipe over? He says, rahimahullah ta'ala, وَصَحَّ أي الْمَسْحُ عَلَى الْمُوقِ. Right? And some people call this al-jarmuq. Right? It's permitted to wipe over an over khuff. Right? The muq is an over khuff. Right? It's a khuff you wear on top of a khuff, basically. It's a leather. It's a leather over sock that you wear over the khuff to protect it, for example. Right? هو جلد يلبس فوق الخف لحفظه من الطين وغيره. It's something made of skin that you would wear over the khuf to protect it from mud and the like. So it's like an over khuf. So it's valid to wipe over muq if it fulfills the conditions of a khuf. وعلى الجورب المجلد والمنعل والثخين. And on socks with leather tops, so it's a sock made of, some kind of whatever material the sock is made from, if the top is leather or the bottom is leather. Mujallad, or which is the top is leather, the muna'al, and some say al-mun'al, which is the bottom is of leather. And this is originally the opinion of Imam Abu Hanifa, that the leather, a sock that is thick and sturdy, but this is important, the sock is thick and sturdy. Originally Abu Hanifa said you cannot wipe over a sock, even if it's thick and sturdy, unless its top is leather or its bottom is leather. That's his original opinion. The Sahibain from the beginning allowed wiping over thick socks. وَصَحَّ رُجُوعُ الْإِمَامِ إِلَى قَوْلِهِمَا. The Imam Abu Hanifa returned to the position of the Sahibain with respect to the socks, and actually in his final sickness, radiallahu ta'ala anhu, on the thick sock, right? And he says, لا على عمامة, it's not valid. لا أي لا يصح المسح على عمامة. It is not valid to wipe over a turban. Why? Because of what we took in the beginning of the class. The dispensation of wiping over khuff is a dispensation established contrary to the qiyas, so to analogy, so you cannot make analogy on it. That's number one. Number two, and then there is no basis for it. Now here the hadith patrol can come, say hadith alert, hadith alert. There are hadiths that the Prophet ﷺ wiped over his turban. Those hadiths are singular transmissions. Number one. Number two, there is difference of opinion as to whether they're even established. That there's discussion about the strength of the evidence. Especially if you consider the meaning, that, because the fuqaha don't just look at the narration, but the meaning. This goes against what's widely established. They look at it more questioningly. Right? Because something that corresponds, even because the way the fuqaha look at a hadith, if a hadith's narration is weak, but it corresponds in meaning to what's well established, they'll be willing to accept it. Even if the muhaddithin say, but it's weak, say no, but it corresponds to what's established. And there's a dynamic tension with the fuqaha and muhaddithin about that. Right? But when the chain of transmission seems sound, but the meaning of the hadith goes against what is established, the muhaddithin's focus is the sanad. The fuqaha's focus is the text. Right? Thubut al-ma'na an al-Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So this is problematic. But even if the hadith we say is sound about wiping on the turban, there's still a problem. One is, it's non-detailed, it's mujmal. It's non-detailed. It says he wiped over a turban. We don't know what kind of turban he wiped on. Number two, we don't know how he wiped on it, on some of the narrations. Right? And these kinds of incidents, these are called waqi'atul hal, a singular incident. Right? Singular incidents. And Imam al-Shafi'i has a beautiful, he expressed a beautiful principle that others adopt the wording for. That وقائع الحال إذا تطرق إليها الاحتمال كسيت ثوب الإجمال وسقط عنها الاستدلال. It's a beautiful expression. وقائع الحال, individual incidents. إذا تطرق إليها الاحتمال, individual incidents. If various possibilities, meaning various reasonable possibilities, arise regarding it. Why did this happen? كسيت ثوب الإجمال, it's considered non-detailed. We don't really know what kind of wiping this was. وسقط عنه الاستدلال, then it does not become a decisive proof. And this is discussed very nicely by Imam al-Nawawi in his Majmu' Sharh al-Muhadhab. Because even with the presence of the hadiths on wiping on the turban were not taken by the Hanafis, were not taken by the Malikis, were not taken by the Shafi'is. Imam Ahmad allowed it, but with a condition. Why? And that's also a problem of comparative fiqh. Because say, well, the Hanbalis allow it. But how do they allow it? Because some narrations mention that he wiped over his turban. Others mention that he completed his wiping over the turban. completed his wiping over the turban. Other narrations mention that the turban was muhannak, right? Was the turban had its what do you call it? The tail of the turban, what? The tail of the turban was wrapped around him because it was during a travel. So one of the styles, and you see some of the desert people, that if they're on a journey or if they're walking in the desert, the tail of the turban, they'd wrap around their face. One, to keep the turban secure, so it gets windy, the turban stays secure. The other, that if it gets windy and there's dust in the air, etc., they can cover their face and mouth. And for other reasons. Right? Bandits would do it too, but here, so that kind of turban being wrapped around like this, it'd be difficult to remove. Right? So Imam Ahmad took the permissibility with the conditions that it be like the condition the turban described. But the Hanafis and the Shafi'is and the Malikis didn't take it. But if one is in a circumstance where, so one cannot wipe over a turban, full stop, in terms of the minimum wiping. But if one is in a situation where one can't wipe over the, like it's difficult to take off the turban, then you can move the turban back. This would be considered. You wipe a quarter of the head, and then you can finish wiping, and you intend the sunnah that the Prophet ﷺ did this on occasion. But the minimum wiping must be on the turban or on a cap. You cannot wipe over a cap. The qalanswa is a cap. Right? It's a foreign word. Right? وَبُرْقُعْ, and the face veil. Because there's no basis, you can't make analogy on the khuff, and there's no basis for wiping over face gear. وَقُفَّازَيْن, or gloves, for the same reason. And just like the face veil, you can't wipe over the hijab. Now, let's say if some sister got some hijab tied in a manner that she can't undo it. Right? Let's say she has zealous parents and they locked her hijab. Now she has to make wudu at school. Not a good idea, parents. Like if children drift, you have to take care of the quwwatul iman, right? So she can't take off her hijab because there's an alarm on it, and like this, it's called the security hijab. Little problem. You can't, as a Hanafi, you can't wipe over it. Thankfully, it's not waterproof. So wiping is not that you wipe. What is the definition of wiping? The wetness to reach the area. So how can you wipe the head without wiping the head, given that you cannot wipe just the hijab?
Wash the head with the hijab on.
Not wash. Wipe the head with the hijab on, with the legal wiping, which is all you have to do is to, no, because washing the head with the hijab on, we have to be careful about meanings. Washing is for water to flow over the area. So washing the head is for water to flow over the head. That's not a requirement. It just has to be wiped. What's the legal definition of wiping? For wetness to reach the limb. So here, if a sister, or let's say a sister wears a tarha, right? A single piece tarha, the long hijab, and now it would be awkward for her to take that off. Especially, there's a lot of, let's say she's at the park and there's a whole bunch of people who are dressed strange and acting strange, and she does not feel comfortable, and there appears to be a security camera there, etc. She doesn't want to take off her hijab. There's multiple things one can do. One is one can stick one's hand inside the hijab and wipe, or loosen the hijab and stick one hand. There's many ways. Or you could just take enough water that till you're reasonably sure that the area has been wetted, and that's valid. But what you cannot do is simply wipe the hijab itself, or the cap itself, or the turban itself, right? And that's just an example of, there's a hadith, the ulama are aware of the hadith, but even if the hadith is sound, the issue is, okay, the hadith is sound, but what does it mean? What does it mean? And there's many examples of that. There's a very important work called Athar al-Hadith al-Sharif fi Ikhtilaf al-Fuqaha of Shaykh Muhammad Awama. It's been translated into English, I think by Turath Publishing or something, right? We can share a link to that. You don't have to read it, but this is one of the most important works on the subject. Shaykh Talal al-Ahdab, or Canadian Muslim scholar, now at Zaytuna, mashallah. He mentioned to me before I went overseas to study that he'd read that book cover to cover 26 times. This was the year 97, right? And I thought it was an exaggeration, but it's a brilliant, brilliant work, right? And this one, the reason, okay, yes, even if we say the hadith, what does it mean? Who determines meanings? The fuqaha. That's why Imam al-Haskafi mentions from the ulama, they say, قالوا لا يعلم مراد الله من خلقه إلا الفقهاء. No one knows what Allah wants from His servants except the fuqaha, right? Right? So in that sense, like, ultimately, what are we responsible to do? The fuqaha say, okay, you guys can all be fancy. The grammarians talk grammar. The theologians talk theology. Mufassirin talk tafsir. Muhaddithin say whatever you want to say about the hadith, its strength. When it comes to, okay, what does the verse mean in terms of human actions? Who has a say? Only the fuqaha, right? Like, in terms of what is the ruling derived from that Quranic verse, the only person who has a say are the fuqaha. The mufassirin can draw general guidance, etc., but ultimately, right, who determines if this deduction is sound insofar as it relates to human actions? Which is why أنفع العلوم is fiqh بهذه الحيثية, insofar this is the science that relates to your actions. So these are the things you cannot wipe over, and we looked at why. There's one part that remains, and inshallah, I apologize, things came up so we started late. We'll begin next class, and inshallah, next class we'll begin right at 3. My apologies. I know we've been late last couple of times, but we'll start right at 3. So we'll start by completing the sections brief on bandages and casts. We'll start with that, and then begin a very important section, which is menstruation. We'll take a few minutes to take any questions that you may have. Alhamdulillah, we have quizzes that have been developed for the Kanz, mashallah, by some of the students here in Toronto, and I've been approving them. So we're putting those up this week, inshallah. Just note that down. So you can use those to review what we've covered so far. They'll be with each of the classes. Even if you're catching the class live, we can put it, if you check the course forum, that's part of completing the class, is to please complete those quizzes. They serve as a good review and consolidation. We would urge you, as we mentioned in the beginning of the class, to write out the text and catch those key notes. Definitions are, Shaykh Adib Kallas, rahimahullah ta'ala, would mention something obvious but students neglected, which is, you can call it a truism, but تُعْرَفُ الْأُمُورِ بِتَعْرِيفِهَا. Matters are known by their definitions. And one of the reasons people struggle to understand things is that you don't even know the definition. What is wiping? Wiping is wiping. That's not a definition. Wiping is to pass your hand over something. No, it's not. Right? 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 It's not. That's maybe the sunnah wiping, etc. But that's not the legal wiping, right? So that's one of the things. I'm avoiding going into too many details. Like my notes are a lot more detailed than this, but what is significant are these critical definitions, like what is wiping over Khuffs, what is wiping over Khuffs, what is the definition of the Khuff. Conditions and integrals are critical, and we mentioned that, right? And now we're at a level, a text like this, that the talib ilm, the talib is an ism fa'il. It's an ism fa'il, right? And the ism fa'il indicates the one who is actively characterized by that quality, which is talab, right? So, and our duty isn't to, our duty is to encourage you, to remind you, but it's not to, this is not kindergarten, right? This is Kanz al-Daqa'iq. Is that, for the talib, if it's said, okay, you can summarize, there's 9 points you need to summarize from the Maraqi, or from Nur al-Idah, or from the Hadiyah al-Alaiyah. Literally, it'll take you 10 minutes to do it. You do it. If you don't, right? In the spiritual path, the ulama say, عَجَزَ الْمَشَايِخ أَنْ يُزَحْزِحُ مُرِيدًا لَا يُجَاهِدُ نَفْسَهُ. The mashayikh, the scholars of the spiritual path, have proved incapable of shaking a seeker who won't do mujahada against themselves. Because the shaykh of spirituality can tell you, this is what you need to be working on. But the work must come, the seeking must come from the seeker. The talab must come from the talib. We can transmit, we can point, we can encourage, we can remind, we can even nag a little bit, but ultimately it's on you. But they also say, الشجاعة صبر ساعة, that bravery is a moment's patience. Sa'a, it's a lahza. That what is bravery or courage is a moment's patience, right? A moment's patience, right? Right? That okay, the class finishes, there's a couple of things that are, and one of the ways to do things is not to put them off, right? Is not to put them off, right? If there's something to look up, immediately after class, take a few minutes, just do it. And don't put it off, right? Right? That's one of the simple tricks. I say, okay, I'll do it, but later. The only way you should agree not to do something immediately is if you specify a time for it. Right? That's why one of the things we'd recommend any talib ilm to do is you should have a system to, basically in modern lingo, what we call a personal productivity system. You follow a system to keep track of what you have to do. Senior fuqaha, like, for example, there's a young faqih from Hadramaut, came from Yemen to Amman for medical treatment. I wanted to meet Shaykh Nuh Keller. I said, why? He said, I have a whole bunch of questions related to the books of the Shadhidis. I said, what? He prepared his questions. He's never met the Shaykh, but he heard this is great scholar of. So the Shaykh was young, he's a bit intimidated to ask to see the Shaykh. He was staying with Shaykh Ali Hani. I said, Shaykh Ali, you ask the Shaykh. Like, what? Yes, like, kebab mein haddi. It's like, like I'm the bone in the kebab. Like, what's my role in all of this? The guy who wants to meet the Shaykh's right there coming out of the masjid, just ask him. He's staying with you, you ask on his behalf. No, you go ask. Both of them were standing behind the minaret. It's like a standalone minaret. Like two big scholars. They felt shy from the Shaykh. I'm like a Bedouin. I just went, Assalamu alaikum, Shaykh. There's a young Shafi'i faqih from Hadramaut. He'd like to see you. He teaches at the Ribat in Tareem, etc., etc. I'm now thinking, where is the Shaykh? Him and Shaykh Ali were standing by the minaret. He said, I would love to meet him. Where are they? I didn't want to say they're behind the minaret. I said, just 1 second. I said, Tafaddalu. They brought them from behind the minaret. He says, the first thing the Shaykh said to him, I have at least 25 questions that I have written down in Shafi'i fiqh that I want addressing. You know, Shaykh Nuh's a very capable Shafi'i faqih himself. Right? Similarly, and you see that any time the ulama meet, they always have many questions. Why? Because they keep track of their questions. Right? The things that they're researching, things that they're thinking about, things that they're wondering about. Similarly, a talib al-ilm, all these things, you keep track of things. Like to have a system by which you keep track. One, the principles that one should have a routine for one's day, for one's week. Plan out one study, just as one you do in any profession, anything. To structure it. It's one of the most beneficial things to do, to learn some system of personal productivity that you apply. And there's many such systems that are out there. One of the ones that I found that is closest to the habits that you see from the mashayikh is what's called GTD, getting things done. It's a system by David Allen. It's a tool, but it's very straightforward, effective system, right? Of keeping track of things, setting times for things, defining contexts for when you get things done, reviewing what you need to get done. Any small tasks, just get it done right away. So you're sitting to study, got a whole bunch of small tasks, and it's okay, I'll do those later. No, just a moment's patience and just get it done. Right? There's to read a page from Nur al-Ilah, just get it done, because if you don't do it now, when will you get it done? Any questions?
Assalamu alaikum, Shaykh. I just had a question. I was reading the Marafa in preparation for the class. I just wanted to ask what exactly, when he says muqaddamul qadam, what part of the foot is that?
Muqaddamul qadam is anything beyond, anything below the, anything past the heel. Right, from the top. Muqaddamul qadam would be anything past the heel, mimma yasihhu mashuhu. Right? Anything past the heel, which would be of the front part of the foot. Right? Because the aqib laysa mahallan lil mash. Because if all that remains, if there's only a stump remaining of the foot, nasallallahu al-afiyah, but it's just the heel, what the back of the foot called? The bulb, the heel. Can you wipe over the heel? No, you can only wipe over the top. The muqaddam, right, from the front part, the top. Like conceivable if you had, if the, so it's a, muqaddam al-qadam, of the front of the foot. So it's beyond the heel of the top part of the foot. If conceivably, nasallallahu al-afiyah, if the bottom of the foot remained, but all the top was cut off, and just tell the person, like obviously that they can't. So then they, if it's healed, then they would, we'll look at bandages and casts, like there. If they wash what they can and they wipe what they can, and if they can't wipe it, it would be excused. But you can't, and we'll see, you can't join between washing and wiping, right? You can't wash one foot and wipe the khuff on the other. Any other questions, inshallah?
Why is the takbir of the masr here different from the one in wudu?
Sorry?
Why is the takbir of the masr here different than in wudu?
Why is the taqdeer of wiping, extent of wiping? Because in wudu it's textually established, right? And we took, in wudu, why is it a quarter of the head? Right? The usuli perspective is, it's established by the Quranic text. The hadiths confirm it. This is the taqdeer. here one must wipe over the khuff, right? Alatul masih is the yad, right? Alatul masih عادة is the yad, is the hand, right? And you're only and then it goes back to understanding the Arabic language, that you're not like, if I wipe my forehead with one finger, could you say مسح يعني مسحت الجبهة بيدي if I use one finger? Even in English, I wipe my forehead with my hand. Is this considered my hand? No, it's my finger. If I use two fingers, no. Anything less than, if I use three fingers, now it looks like my hand. And this goes back to classical Arabic, that if you say al-masah bil-yad, the Arabs only considered that you would only ascribe the ruling to the hand if you use most of it. And most of it is the extent of three fingers. So they're two completely separate considerations. On the head, because wamsahu bi ru'usikum, right? Because of the understanding of the ba there, and the I mean, like a Pakka Hanafi would say, that's it. Even though there's no hadith about it, that's what would be understood. But there is hadith, so we say, and this is confirmed by the hadith. Others would argue that, and if you're being diplomatic, one could say this: look, the ba could potentially have more than one meaning. The usul wise, the Hanafis would not admit that. But if we said, okay, let's just be conciliatory, more than one, what's the least that is established from the hadith about wiping? It's the nasiya, but nasiya plus mash equals a quarter of the head. Because the nasiya is just the front of the head, what do you call it, forelock or whatever. This is the front part of the head. So the nasiya itself is less than a quarter. But you put it on the front and you do mash. If I put my hand on my head, you say I wiped? In the language, no. Wipe is imrarul yad ala shay, is to move your hand. See this? But now if I moved it slightly, did I wipe? Yes. The slightest movement, you hit a quarter. So there's two different considerations. Here we have to wipe with our hand. So the least that's considered wiping with hands is the extent of three fingers. Three fingers come in contact with the foot. That's you wiped with your hand. So minimum wiping is the extent of three fingers of each khuff. Now the whole, on the other hand, is the extent of three toes, because the whole relates to the place. So you consider the toes. The wiping is with the hand, so you consider three fingers. And there's also various textual bases for these that the larger text mentioned, but let's understand things step at a time. I mean, those who are fascinated by the textual side of things, some of these you can find hadiths related to it in the Maraqi. More on the legal side of things, an accessible book is Fath Bab al-Inaya, FBI, of Mullah Ali al-Qari. That's reasonably clear, and it mentions the hadiths. So we'll stop there. Any other questions before we close? وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين.